Um, but when we come to drugs and alcohol, and particularly when it comes to young people, there's a lot of concern around professionals. What we're often told is, well, what happens if I ask those questions and they tell me they're using drugs and alcohol? What do I do about that? Where does that go? What if I open up that can of worms and I can't put the lid back on? And so a lot of what we'll do today is to look at helping you to be more confident in asking those questions and having those thoughts in your mind around that. Um, so I'm using a presentation now that has been created. It was originally created by a colleague in the adult services with myself, called Charlie McCraig, who he's up in the North team for anyone who might know him. So I have to credit him for part of this presentation, and obviously Christy as well, who also added her bits and pieces to that. But it does mean that I might kind of slightly lose my way a little bit as we go along, but bear with me. Okay. So hopefully, as we've said, it's about raising awareness around substances, the effect of those, the impact that it has on young people and adults and families. And so that will really be our focus, will be young people and families at the moment, but we've obviously got the privilege of having Christy here as well. So she will be able to also give you some of her expertise around working with adults really, and working with adults who also obviously have families and children. Okay. Oh, that's yeah. So the first things first, what is a drug? Well, actually, there's a load of different definitions. The one I tend to use is a public health one, which is a drug that's any substance that, when taken into the living organism, affects the central nervous system, thereby modifying behavior and thought processes. So, in essence, what happens is a drug goes in and it goes into then up to your brain, or the effect goes up to your brain, and then your brain will use a set of brain chemicals, because you've got loads and loads of different brain chemicals in there that get triggered, and that gives you then that response. But we'll see. Oh, okay, so the Oxford Dictionary, however, says a medicine, because we know that a lot of drugs, and in fact a lot of illicit substances, a lot of illegal substances, are often also used in medicinal circumstances under professionals, obviously, and so we'll sort of explore that a little bit later. So we have to recognise that drugs actually can be helpful as well as not. So they're saying a medicine or other substance which has physiological effect when ingested or otherwise introduced into the body system. I think we've got another one from Science Daily there, psychoactive drug or psychotropic. I love that word. Substance is a chemical substance that acts primarily upon the central nervous system, so that be your brain, and where it alters brain function, resulting in temporary changes in perception, mood, consciousness, and behavior. So that's quite a big, wide definition. Oh, I'm trying to move on. For some reason, my slide is stuck now. Oh, there we go. Now, one of the things we're often asked is about what is a typical drug user? And it's an incredibly difficult thing to say. Oh, blimey. Sorry, my technology is going a bit weirdy now. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, absolutely fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's because I've lost my ability to see you now for some unknown reason. So you'll have to just sort of bear
Don't worry,
with me.
we can see you and we can see the slides.
Ah,
So
that's
it's okay.
the main thing. I'll just fly blind, so I can't see anyone, so that's probably a good thing. But yeah, actually, there is probably no such thing as a typical drug user. We would look at stereotypes, but sometimes stereotypes don't fulfill what a drug user is. And what we also know is there's a lot of hidden drug use within society. Some would argue that since society really started, drug use has been within it. If we look at alcohol, for example, it's been around since about 12,000 BC. It's been fundamentally fused with religion, and so it's also one of the first known recipes was for making beer. So actually, we can see where early on substances have formed a part of it. If we look at cannabis, for example, that goes back to about 5000 BC, more as a medical entity more than a recreational one. Recreational use started in around about the 15th, 16th century. Ironically, actually, anyone who's watched Hamnet recently or that film, which is sort of fictional basis around Shakespeare, they found in Shakespeare's pipes, they discovered amounts of hallucinogenic substances as well as cannabis. So it does make me wonder which play did he write when under the influence. I'm thinking cannabis, it must be something like Midsummer Night's Dream. Anyway, all fairies and stuff like that. Okay, but why do young people use drugs, or why do people use drugs? There are so many different versions here, and Charlie had helpfully put it into social, emotional, and physiological. We can't get away from the fact that substances will often um, give people positive feelings. And so, because if they didn't, if it always punished you every time you took a substance, you would probably never take that substance again. Obviously, we have also things which some of you might know about reinforcement. So we might have a variable reinforcement, a little bit like gambling, where sometimes you'll take a substance and it makes you feel good, and other times you take a substance and it might not. But you might hold out for that one time when it makes you feel good. So that excitement, there's the wanting to fit in. The one that the Misuse of Drugs Act works on is availability, because quite frankly, if it isn't available, no one can actually use it. But here's the thing. The Misuse of Drugs Act, as good as it is, the police within their resourcing are only able to target a certain amount of say drug dealers or importers or such like, and often that represents a drop in the ocean, as well intentioned as the law is. But that often it only just scratches the surface of the actual substance misuse that's there. But it's a good attempt to try to get rid of that availability. Family influence is an interesting one, and what we have a project called the Y Project, which I'll talk about a little bit later, which is our work to support young people impacted on by parental or family member substance misuse. And in certain circumstances, the nature of chaos that can surround a family, if we add things like ACEs, so adverse childhood experience, into that, or those trauma kind of things, then we often will get an invalidating environment that could make someone more vulnerable to substance misuse. In some cases, parental substance misuse, family member substance misuse can have almost a reverse effect for certain substances. I've had young people who've been totally against, say, the opiate family, the heroin and such like, but yet they're chronic cannabis users, and they somehow seem to sort of make a differentiation and find it difficult when we pose that question of is it different, that much different? For some of our people, it is a sense of risk taking. We do have certain individuals who are much more likely to be attracted to certain types of substances. So, those who are more likely to want to take risk would be possibly more likely to head towards stimulants. I'll talk about these in a minute, and things that kind of evoke a fight, flight, freeze response in someone, things that work on a part of the brain called the amygdala, which is in between your ears. And so some people would be orientated towards that, whereas other people, it might be a way of closing down. It might be a way of trying to shut down things. In some cases, it can also be more acopic, used as a coping strategy, a way to deal with dis-ease, with those feelings of negativity and those hard to grasp challenges that people often have, and particularly around mental health, trauma, and such like. Um, so, but also boredom. There's the curiosity. With a lot of young people, they're curious to learn new experiences. That doesn't necessarily mean substance misuse or substance use. It can mean many other ways, but that formative kind of stage, once you've had your, or when you're going through that sort of new synaptic pruning, which finishes around about 25 years old. During that time, it's about, finding who you are, finding where you belong, finding where you fit into that, plus a sense of also risk that comes into it. We know that risk in itself can actually be healthy, providing there's a learning behind it and providing that it's relatively calculated risk. So it does have its place in terms of young people's development as well. Peer influence. I'm glad me and Charlie had this discussion when we put this bit together because we talked about this, and often a lot of professionals, parents, others will talk about peer pressure. So, peer pressure is an externalized pressure on the individual to conform to a societal norm. Whereas I prefer a phrase which is peer clustering or peer influence, which is that we have a sense of belonging. We want to belong to a something, and in some cases, that belonging means adhering to a set of principles within that group. And so often the pressure is the individual placing the pressure on themselves to conform to that group. So that it's a subtle difference, but and I'm not saying there aren't drug pushers on there are and there are, and we know there's exploitative aspects to substance misuse and to dealing and such like as well. So, but it is mainly the individual's internal pressure that they place on themselves to be in that part of that something as well. We've got enjoyable there. We can't get away from the fact that some substances could be pleasurable on some level in the short term, maybe. And so people might want to redo that. If we look at the reward system in your brain, the bit that kind of helps us with surviving over eons as human beings, we no longer have to really survive in the same sort of way. And so that reward system is often, being triggered in different ways. We often get triggered with our reward system when we eat. We get dopamine released and those feel good kind of chemicals. And so that's not dissimilar to how substances might work on the system. So the emotional bit starts to look at kind of underlying bits and pieces. And we know that there's an element of escape to it. Alcohol is often very associated with trauma and to cope and a way of dealing with things. And as I discussed earlier with the earlier group, when people then try to come off of alcohol, even though that has to be done gently in some cases because it could be very dangerous if they just immediately stop. However, if people are deciding to come off of that alcohol, if they don't have the support to deal with the reasons why they're doing it in the first place, then they're likely to not be very successful in receiving treatment. It's often about looking at the everything else as well as the substance, and then the substance bit will fit in line with that. Um, so if you imagine alcohol to be something a bit like a psychic glue, it sort of holds stuff and puts it off. It doesn't deal with anything. So of course, when you come off of it, everything then comes to the surface, and that can be extremely overwhelming for people to work with. And then we've got things like dependence. So dependence, or which is also addiction. I would say there's two different kinds in a very simplistic way. Oh, by the way, whilst we're talking here, we're not necessarily talking from an academic place. Obviously, there are very intelligent professors out there and such like who could talk in a depth that I would really struggle with. So we're talking about the sort of our learned through lines over the years of working in this profession. So just to kind of clarify that. But yeah, so in terms of dependence, in terms of addiction, the first one is physical addiction. So a physical addiction really is when you stop taking that drug, you will get an adverse physical reaction to stop taking it. So your brain will be telling you that the way to, because we're very good as humans at short term, and there must be, if you feel ill, you take a pill. If you do this, then that happens. And so when you're in that place of physical addiction, your brain will be trying to convince you that to feel well, you're going to need to use that drug. And in the short term, that will happen. So if you go and you start withdrawing, getting very unpleasant physical reactions, and you use the drug, it will make you feel better initially. But here's the thing, in the long term, that's going to make the situation a whole lot worse. Um, so that would be what we'd call physical addiction. But of course, as human beings, we're also psychological beings. And so some would argue that the psychological part of addiction is worse and harder to deal with than the physical addiction. The physical addiction can be medicated with. There's a range of different strategies that the adult services and ourselves might put in place to deal with physical addiction. But you're always left with the reasons why, with the triggers, and with different sort of things that come up. The way I like to explain it is that internally you have almost like an internal spoilt child, So if you imagine that spoilt child as wanting something, if you then give them what they want, as well as being slightly smug, as my children have sometimes done in the past, they also it sets up a pathway if they always get what they want and then suddenly they're not going to. And so then young people will often, do a temper tantrum, dead weight themselves, do any number of different things to deal with that. And then if you then give them what they want, it then sets that pathway up in their brain. So it's very similar to how our brains work. Your brain will kind of be not very happy when you're not using what it wants and what it makes it feel nice. And so it will try to convince you, if you like, to reuse that substance. And that can be related to where you're at, who you're with. All of those things can act as triggers to use. For some of our problematic substance misusing young people and adults, they only realize what their triggers are when they try to stop. So, and that's part of the process of what ourselves and our adult colleagues will always be doing is to be working with them around, those triggers, what's making them use, and what can we do to try to deal with that. Okay. Oh, well, there you go. I've already talked ahead of myself there. This is an example of me not reading ahead. Um, so physical addiction, dependence, physical condition caused by chronic use of a tolerance forming drug. So tolerance is the more you use, the more you need to use to get the same effect. In effect, your brain doesn't like being too much one way. So what it does is it tries to balance itself. It tries to release an opposite set of chemicals to balance its way out. And then when the drug wears off, you're left with this opposite set, which could go some way towards describing things like withdrawal. So we would often say with stimulants, for example, what goes up must come down. So at some point, people are going to come down. And for some of those people, they don't want to. So they will continue to try to use to keep themselves up. Um, so yeah, so it can cause those unpleasant reactions. So there are not many of the classical drugs that are physically addictive, but the main ones are alcohol, opiates, benzodiazepines. I don't believe they're prescribed anymore. But Christy might be better at knowing that in the adult sector. So yeah, opiates, and then also things like nicotine. So we know smoking is incredibly addictive, and yeah, and very very hard to come off of. So nowadays we've got a slight shift away from classical smoking into more vaping, and we're on a bit of a societal experiment at the moment in terms of the long-term impact of vaping. We know there's some emerging evidence to suggest some of the additives can be not very good for lung function, but I think the jury's out in terms of the long term. However, if it's used for what it was designed for, which was as an aid to stop smoking, then it is a less harmful. It's less harmful than smoking itself. The challenge is for young people is we're getting a number of young people, and I'm sure there's a number of professionals here might be aware of this, is there are a number of young people who may not have actually smoked, but are seeking out vapes. So I know public health are doing some stuff around vaping and their smoking pathways. So we may see in the future some bits and pieces coming out. We've got colleagues in Smoke Free Devon that are doing and overseeing a lot of that in terms of getting people seen with nicotine addiction. So psychological, again, as we said, it's not necessarily physical dependence, although sometimes it can look like it is, because your brain is a powerful thing and can induce physical reactions sometimes. So I alluded to stimulants earlier. So when we look at drug groups, this is like taking yourself down a rabbit hole. Now, drug workers absolutely love going down those rabbit holes and learning everything there is to know about substances and stimulants and drugs. But in terms of for what you guys might need, you do not need to be an expert. I never call myself an expert in drugs and alcohol because after 25 years, I still am not. There are too many variables. We know that you can add a drug to a person, and dependent on that person, you might get different outcomes, different experiences that each person has. I mean, you guys might have experienced that with, for instance, alcohol. So you might go out and you might have certain friends that react in a certain way to alcohol and other ones that react in a totally different way, but they might be drinking exactly the same thing. So there is variation, and so as a result of all those variables, it can be almost impossible to be an expert in those sort of things. But we classify drugs into very simplistic groups. If you are really, really interested in learning a lot more, then there is a drug wheel that's been created by a guy called Mark Adley. And on the wheel, it's got like one of those little discs, a bit like the drink aware drink ones that most people pick up, look at how many units are in something, realize they're drinking too much, and put down very quickly. But that one's really good. But that talks about entheogens, dissociatives, and a whole range of other different types of substances. But if you're interested in that, then please seek that out. You can look on the internet. So it's Mark Adley. But we will break it down into more simplistic. So stimulants, those drugs that speed up the central nervous system. We've talked a little bit about the impact on the amygdala with certain of those substances. We have things like cocaine, which is it's called a reuptake blocker, but it triggers dopamine in the system. Again, have a look these up. There's a website which is Talk to Frank. And although some of the bits are a little bit older, the A to Z of drugs is kept and updated very regularly, and it's a really good quick way of going in and getting information about those substances. But here's also the thing when we're working with our young people is that you don't have to be that expert around drugs and alcohol. But it's about the journey. So in a very Dan Hughes kind of way, you'd be looking at co-exploring with young people around what they're doing and why they're doing it. If we go down the route of saying, I know that, like, for instance, I did many years ago, I got caught in the trap that I tell everyone else not to do, but I completely did it because I'm human. And so a young person was using ecstasy, and they called it Mandy, because obviously the chemical name is MDMA, methyl dioxymethylamphetamine. And so they were calling it Mandy, and I said, so the first mistake, I said, oh, that's ecstasy. At which point the young person went, no, it's not. And at which point I went, yes, it is. And then it kind of went like that for a little bit until the young person completely dysregulated in the session, saying, I'm not an effing scientist. At which point, we reflect on our practice, and I realized that I went straight away to a different place. What I should have done, even though I knew that it was ecstasy, what I should have done is allowed us to co-explore that, to ask the W's, to get down that. So what did it look like? Where did you get it? How did it make you feel? Who were you with? What did you learn? And those things then get you alongside that young person and then allow you to start to pick apart where they're at. So, stimulants, those up drugs that can be activating. Depressants, exactly the opposite. So, slowing down the central nervous system. Often, things like alcohol can be a classic depressant. So, it slows down the central nervous system. And an example of that is if you see people of a weekend walking around the place intoxicated, I would suggest that you can see that their functioning is not functioning in accordance with how they would normally walk around the place. I think I often use an analogy of if you put a key in a door normally, you've probably done that thousands of times. If you're very intoxicated, the chances are your messages from your brain to your hand are going to get slightly interrupted, and it may take a little bit of concerted effort to get the key in the lock, even though you've done that numerous times. So that central nervous system depressant thing also lends itself, as we've talked about, into acopic use, using as a coping strategy to cover up stuff because it's sort of is not as activating. So that's depressants. Then we've got hallucinogens. So hallucinogens, the classic hallucinogen would be cannabis. So things that change perceptions, the way you see things, feel things. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to see an elephant go across, or have that real profound hallucination, but it might change the way you hear things slightly. There's cannabis is one of the classics for being a hallucinogen, although it is also a stimulant, a depressant, and a painkiller as well. It's a very interesting substance, and that's to do with these things called endocannabinoid receptors in the brain. Some of the densest populated receptors in the brain, vertebral column, and all sorts. And that's why it triggers so many different aspects of an individual when they use it. In normal circumstances, some cannabis users would say that's because we're predestined to use it. That ain't the case. What it's actually more likely is the endocannabinoid receptors, they act as a dimmer switch, and slow down the over release of other brain chemicals. So in certain circumstances, the flooding of other brain chemicals into the brain can be poisonous. So you have a natural way of sort of damping that down, to prevent that. And it just so happens to that cannabis fits like a key in a lock to those receptors and triggers them off. Anyway, I could go into a lot of depth, but again, that's we don't have the time for that. Um, but there are also others that seem to jump across different groups. Um, so we have the performance and image enhancing drugs. So the things like steroids would be a classical example of that. And what Christy would tell you is that within adult services, they often have classical sort of opiate users, so heroin, and such like would be injecting users seeking out safer needles and safer injecting equipment. But you'd also have a whole different set of individuals who are coming for needles for stimulants, and using those. Then we've got novel or new psychoactive substances. Not really new, even though that was what the government were trying to. They started with new, and then they called them novel, which is an interesting way of describing them. A lot of those substances are slight chemical variations of other things, so they tweak something. So if we looked at there's a whole group of them, including cannabis, synthetic forms of cannabis, so synthetic cannabinoids. Things like spice, you've probably heard in the news and such like, and certainly in the prison sector, spice seems to be creating all sorts of interesting problems in within the prison and the custodial facilities. But in essence, they try to mimic another substance. And in some cases, actually, the person would probably be safer to use the substance itself rather than the synthetic version. We know, for instance, with the cannabis, with synthetic cannabinoids, they're probably better and a little bit, I say safer very loosely, but they're probably a little bit better using cannabis because we know more about cannabis than we do about spice. What we know and things like that, we know that it's a bit of a mobile chemistry experiment going on a societal level, and we can see some very damaging kind of outcomes for those young people. I'm not saying that cannabis isn't damaging, but it has a different set that we are aware of and work with. Um, and then we've got those sort of so-called smart drugs as well. So, in terms of modes of administration, usually most of you should know a lot of these. So, to orally take it goes into the system, down into the stomach. It usually takes quite a long time to get in, anywhere between half an hour and an hour, um, for a lot of different medications, unless they're able to go into the blood capillaries very quickly within your stomach. Um, then inhalation is one of the quickest routes. So smoking, for example, because of course it's already oxygenating, your lungs are already oxygenating the blood, and that goes straight up to your brain. So I can't remember how quick it is, but it's a matter of a number of seconds before that hits. So a very quick way of administering a substance. The same as sort of snorting or the nasal administration. So we know that there's a number of challenges and problems around snorting substances. So historically, people like Daniela Westbrook, Tamara Barmer Tompkinson, is that her name? And they've had the middle part of their noses collapse, so that septum has collapsed through often things like cocaine use, and such like. So yeah. Then we've got intravenous. So in terms of all the different injecting, uh, there is three different types of injection. So the first one is intravenous, so injecting into a vein. Very a quick way of getting the substance into your system, but there is a big problem because if you introduce bacteria or some sort of infection, that goes straight into your system, and that will flood straight into your blood. So that's a big problem. If you miss a vein and hit something else, that's not good. So there's a range of kind of challenges, and injecting is probably the most dangerous way to administer a substance. Then we have a type of injecting called intramuscular injecting. So that's into muscle mass. So again, the classical one for that would be steroids. So into that muscle mass. And then the last one, would be subcutaneous. So subcutaneous, also known as skin popping. So you guys would be aware of EpiPens used in treatment diabetes. And so those EpiPens go just underneath the skin and put the substance, deliver the substance straight under the skin. It's not often that you get subcutaneous injecting with illicit substances. However, with some very entrenched uh, users, they will often run out of injecting sites, and then they might seek to start injecting in other places. So that is a big worry. So yeah, so that's one of the things. Ocular drug delivery. Now, this was made popular by, I think, of those of a certain age, Kevin and Perry film. I think there was someone who was administering alcohol through the eye. Um, Not a great way to do anything, I would suggest, and risk of blindness is probably extremely high with that. However, I suppose again the blood capillaries behind the eye would be would get the substance into the system fairly quickly. Transdermal diffusion. Um, am I right in thinking, Christy? Because I would call that absorption. Um,
Yes.
yes. So again, in normal circumstances, absorption would be things like nicotine patches, stuff like that, where that substance absorbs into the system, um, and then it goes up and affects the brain. Okay,
Do
are
you
we all
mind if I
happy?
just say something quickly
Oh, of course you can. Yeah.
about intravenous
Yes.
use? Just from
Absolutely.
a I don't know how much we're planning on going into sort of harm reduction as it is, but when we're talking about routes of drug administration, sort of especially within the adult sector, because we tend to see a lot more um heroin and illicit opiate use. The main harm minimization advice that we would give is that IV use is probably the most dangerous and the most likely going to cause overdose. The reason being is that it is an instant hit, so it's going straight into the blood. Whereas we would suggest that people smoke substances instead because you've got the option of slowing down how quickly you're using. You can test the strength of something a lot easier. You can get a little bit of an idea about how it's making you feel before you decide to use a bit more. When it comes to IV use, you are injecting straight into the vein and there's no going back once it's gone in there. The only caveat I'll add to that is, and this is a whole different topic that you could talk about for hours, is if using steroids, injecting is the only method we would encourage injecting, um, because it is the safest when it comes to steroid use. But like I said, that's a whole different topic in itself. But yeah, when it comes to illicit use, we always encourage um, smoking, especially when it comes to opiates, as the sort of safer form because you can get more of an idea of strength. And unfortunately, um, the way that drugs are made now, you just have absolutely no idea what the strength or um, even the content of substances is going to be. So smoking is always going to be safer.
That's brilliant. That's really helpful. Thank you, Christy.
Thank you.
Um, okie doke. So stimulants, just to go over. So the effects that you might see is that increased nerve and brain activity, that activating, increased heart rate. Um, yeah, now that's an interesting one. We that allowed access to stored energy. We often get young people that tell us, "Oh yeah, they give me energy." No, what they do is use the energy you've already got until you kind of crash at some point. Um, so yeah, wakefulness, alertness, giving individuals a sense of confidence. If you've ever seen individuals under the influence of cocaine, for example, there can often be a real false sense of confidence. But actually, if you look at the flip of that, is if you're a person that really, really struggles with confidence and can't go out, you might decide that you want to seek out a substance. It wouldn't necessarily be the right way to do it, but it might give an effect. We used to get young people who would go out and they didn't, they go out and they'd be interested in seeking out a new partner, obviously if they're over 18, and but they can't talk to girls or can't talk to boys. And so as a result, they might decide to drink, which of course, anyone who goes out and sees very drunk people trying to chat someone up, it becomes really a bit creepy. So, so it might not actually help them with confidence at all, but they might believe that they're doing very, very well, but they probably aren't. So yeah, we can also link stimulant use to mental health challenge, and actually all substance misuse. There is an interchange. There's a which came first bit that comes into that as well. Some people have got underlying mental health issues trying to cover it up using substances. In some cases, some mental health issues can be made even worse by substance misuse. So, notably, things like people who struggle with schizophrenia or forms of psychosis, they may not be good to use cannabis. Or any kind of hallucinogen, because that may well make their situation a whole lot worse. So again, but yeah, could cause pupils to dilate. Sometimes can cause pupils to pin, to so either bigger or really smaller. Um, but again, we're often asked for signs and symptoms, and it's really, really difficult. What I tend to come up with in the end is that if you know your young people and you notice a difference in them or a change, it's about then starting those conversations as to what that change could be and what could have potentially caused it. It might not be substance misuse. You know, if you had, for instance, cerebral palsy, I know that there are a number of people who have cerebral palsy who often are described as being drunk because of the nature of how all those the brain messages are getting confused, and so as a result it might seem on the surface to someone that they could be intoxicated when actually they're not. So we have to be very careful when we look at signs and symptoms, and what I'm saying is know your young person and know when something's different and then co-explore with them. But we'll give you a few bits and pieces to go along with. So that dilated pupils, or the other very pinned pupils as well, dry mouth, nose, bad breath, frequent lip licking, can be frequent sniffing as well. If they're snorting substances, they can cause a lot of damage to the thing. There's a thing called drip back or drop back, where they get this sort of almost like an acidic kind of stuff that goes down the back of their throat. Yeah, it could be that excessive activity. So people hoovering at 3 in the morning. Obviously, any of you guys who normally naturally do that, I'm not criticizing you. That might be your time when you want to do that. However, for some, it might, become a compulsive behavior that happens as a result. Irritable, argumentative, and nervous. Well, that can be all of us on probably a Friday afternoon. Talkative, but conversation often lacks continuity and changes subjects rapidly. So again, but again, that could be a sign of neurodiversity, neurodivergent conditions. So a lot of these can be interchangeable. Runny nose, cold, chronic sinus, and nasal problems could also be connected to a range of other things, not just substances. So depressants is the opposite. So that's the opposite of stimulants, really. Slows down the central nervous system, causing drowsiness, respiratory failure, and its extreme end. Um, High dependence forming. And if we look at alcoholism and so alcohol misuse, it's incredibly impactive on a lot of people, and we can see it often destroying families in many ways and loved ones. Um, so yeah, and then mixing. So we would call that poly drug use. So anything that is mixed together with anything else is not a good idea. And particularly using a depressant as a foundation for any other drug is really not good. So yeah, there's some people who will treat themselves like a mobile chemistry experiment. They take a stimulant, it takes them very high, and then they'll take a depressant to bring themselves down, and then try to regulate themselves with drug use. It's never a good way of doing things. So again, pinned pupils can sometimes happen with depressants. But all the sort of stuff that we would often associate with things like alcohol, so that drowsiness, slurred speech, lack of coordination, memory issues, confusion, slow breathing, decreased blood pressure, dizziness, depression, lethargy, drowsiness, constricted pupils, failing to respond to the light. Um, yeah, scars, so track marks and things that you might see on parts of the body that could represent needles. Although I got bitten by a spider more recently, and frustratingly, it was right in the crease of my elbow. And when I was trying to describe what had happened, I could have sworn the doctor thought that I was, I'd been injecting myself or something because it came up with a mark that was not dissimilar to what I would see with some of our injecting substance misusers. Um, okay, so that's the depressants, hallucinogens. Sorry, I'm going through this so quick, but it's a timings thing as well. So hallucinogens are changing that perception, like we've said. Uh, they can have those long-term effects on mental health, but the pupils dilated as well. So but they can be lots of different types of substances that fit those things like LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, DMT, deoxymethyltryptamide, that is a derivative from ayahuasca, which is a vine that's used in shamanic practices in South America. So we've got a range of different hallucinogens that are there, and obviously, like I say, cannabis as well. Legal highs, so novel psychoactive substances. So we've talked a bit about these. So again, like I said, they're usually analogues of a historical drug. So they're usually like a synthetic version of something. They were often targeted at young people as well. So particularly when you looked at the synthetic cannabinoids, when you look at the packets of them, they're very bright, they're very colourful, but they've got some really horrible names like black mamba. Now, what I know about snakes is I probably wouldn't want to come across a black mamba, and so actually something called that would suggest to me, being a risk averse person, that that's probably not such a good thing. There was one called Total Annihilation. Again, in the title, not something that would seem attractive, but for some of our young people, it is. But as I've said, we really just don't know what the long-term implications of this are. If you change molecules and things, they could in effect become cancer causing. So there could be a range of physical and or mental health problems that are storing up and that we might start coming out. We can see the impact, like I've said earlier, around the prison sector and the impact that things like Spice are having on their prisoners. And so yeah, so it is of a worry. Fortunately, though, and I suppose the one positive here is in the main for young people, we had a huge spike of NPS quite a number of years ago, and then I would love to say it was the authorities and it was us that did lots about it, and that suddenly changed young people's use. But I've got a sneaking suspicion that a peer influence was involved in this because we would be talking to young people and they would know someone who knows someone who knew someone who had a really adverse reaction to it. And they'd often say, I'm not using that horrible stuff because because that caused my mate to go in hospital. They wouldn't think twice about sticking coke up their nose, for example. However, we have to take what we've got with that. And so, in the main, we don't tend to see novel psychoactive substances so much now. So, that's really good because we were very, very worried about that. They used to be called legal highs, which was not correct because they weren't necessarily legal, they just weren't illegal. There's a slight difference in the law. And you just don't know what the strength of them, what substances, and like Christy said earlier, with substances across the board, we like to try to put integrity with dealers and suppliers. But if money is the main driver of that and drugs become a commodity that is making them money, there's a good chance that people might cut corners and use different things that might make their profits higher. We see it on a lower level with Cadbury's with their chocolate, and I think they call it deflation economy, where the chocolate bars have got so small now that it's quite ridiculous, and they're changing all the bits and pieces to do with it again because then the bottom line is they're making more money off of it. So we like to think that that substance misuse and substances aren't like that, but I think there is an element of that that comes into it. Um, okay, so did you want to talk about the steroids at all anymore, Christy? Or I don't know what depth we need to go in really. Um,
I don't think there's anything sort of additional to add in terms of
no, that's what I was
steroids
thinking.
because you could do a whole session about different types of steroids
Yeah,
and the effects of them. Um, I'm happy if anybody's got any additional questions regarding steroid use, if they want to reach out and I can have a conversation separately. Um,
absolutely.
when I sort of explain a little bit in a minute about what our service delivers, we we do have a needle exchange um, within our service, and we do actively encourage steroid users to come in and use the needle exchange to make sure that they're using safe equipment. And we have conversations with them around how to use steroids safely, because unfortunately, steroids are one of those sort of very grey areas
Yeah,
when it comes to the law as well.
yeah, absolutely. Oh, thanks, Christy.
And just
Okay,
to let you
so,
know, Simon,
oh,
we've
yeah,
only got about another 10 minutes left. The
woohoo.
sort of
Okay. That means I talk even quicker. Okay, so alcohol, we know it is the most common of all the substances, really. I think today, if it was discovered today, it would be a Class A drug. It's a very damaging drug. Uh, but it's been with us, like I said earlier, since about 12,000 BC. But it impacts on so many bits of a person biologically, as well as also other individuals. If we talk about sort of pregnancy and such, like we've got things like alcohol fetal syndrome, which is a real significant developmental worry for young people. Plus, also, as I said this morning, there's often association with domestic violence, domestic abuse. So I think the stat that I saw fairly recently was around about 70% of all domestic violence cases have alcohol as a component part. So we've seen it many, many times, and we work with a lot of young people on our thing called the Y Project, which is our work with young people impacted on by parental substance misuse. And we've often seen a significant amount of DV attached to alcohol misuse.
I think just to add to what you said there
Yeah,
about alcohol as well, again, coming from that sort of harm reduction perspective, and the fact that I'm aware there's a lot of other agencies and professionals on this call that might work with people that use alcohol. Um, Alcohol is one of the only substances that people can die from withdrawal. So
yeah,
there's two substances where you can die from withdrawal, and that's benzos and alcohol, if not reduced in a correct way. So as much as unfortunately opiate users feel like they're dying when they're withdrawing from heroin, it's not going to kill them. However, withdrawal from alcohol can be very, very lethal. So if there's ever any concern about trying to support someone with using alcohol, please reach out to a service such as ours or Y-Smart, because we can give some drink down advice that's a lot safer. And GPs should as well be able to give an element of advice as well around safer cut down of drinking. But it's the one substance that we'll say never tell someone to stop drinking, um, because it could have really, really bad side effects.
that's a really,
Hence why
really
people
good
feel
point.
very unwell after a very heavy night of drinking, because their body has gone into withdrawal. Um,
In
so yeah, it's
effect, it's
just something worth
poisonous, isn't it?
sharing as professionals, that if we're working with people that are drinking heavily, that we're not encouraging them to stop their use, but to get some support around how they can cut down.
In young people settings, we'd also use safer drinking limits. And so there's a set drink aware. If you look up drink aware, I think it's .org.uk, or it might be .co.uk. So drink aware was the old Portman Group. Basically, a bit of the profits from the alcohol market and industry go into prevention. And so they do a whole range of different things, adverts on telly, and so they will talk about units. And then it's about to metabolize alcohol, to break down alcohol is about 1 unit per hour to break down alcohol. So if you think of an average beer being around about 3 to 4 units, and that's 3 to 4 units hours to break down 1 pint of beer. So when we've got very chronic alcohol users, you can imagine that they've got, their system is totally flooded with alcohol, and it is in effect poisonous in the way it works on your liver and the way it's metabolized in the system. It metabolizes into a thing called acetaldehyde, which is highly toxic to your liver. Anyway. Okay, so those interventions. So this is where myself and Christie's teams come in, and the sort of things we will do, and the things that work. So we know that one-to-one working does really help, but also group work and things where you're getting people together therapeutically to work on that. In the main, in Y Smart, we tend to mainly do one-to-one working. To create a therapeutic group with young people has a set of challenges around it. and those who do group work would know about those kind of bits and pieces. But I know the adult services are very, very adept at doing group work and therapeutic group work with individuals. Brief interventions. So this is where, there was a big thing back many, many years ago around brief interventions, and solution focused brief therapy comes to mind. Um, and so there are certain approaches that you can do which look at harm reduction approaches, things like needle exchange, which Christy has talked about, advice and guidance and information. Drug services do not condone drug use, but we accept that the start point for a person is if we say don't do that, and particularly to some of our very vulnerable young people, they may well tell us where to stick that advice. So we have to look about getting alongside a young person and finding something that opens a door to other conversations. And harm reduction is a really useful tool because you're getting alongside a person and starting to identify risk and harm. You're starting to then get them to problem solve around what they could do around starting to reduce that. The hope with it is it starts to set up this bit around risk. And we don't want this to become totally risk averse, because we know risk is a component part of development as well, if it's as long as it's relatively safe and secure. But that harm reduction approach can then enable us to start getting them to think about that. Okay. Breaking free, that's something that Christy would be able to talk about.
Yeah, Breaking Free Online is an online resource where it's like a 24-hour service, and we always recommend it to people who are quite actively engaged in their own recovery, or as a resource for when somebody's sort of coming out the other end of their recovery journey and just wants that ongoing support and advice. If accessed through our service, we basically give you like a code and a login to be able to access it online. We've got like a subscription kind of thing with them.
Did you want to talk to these ones as well, Christy? Because I'm
Yeah,
thinking,
I can do
that
quickly.
would make
So
sense, and then that'll tie up what we're, doing
yeah.
later as well.
So mutual aid is within the realms of sort of AA, NA, CA, Smart Recovery, those sort of peer-led support groups. So again, people that are quite actively engaged in their recovery, but also sometimes people aren't necessarily quite suitable for our service, as they don't quite meet the threshold, but going to a mutual aid service such as AA or Smart Recovery might be sort of more suited to them. We take a very person-centered approach, and Why Smart will do exactly the same as Together, in that everybody will get their own assessment of what their needs are, and then the approach taken will be dependent on what that person's needs are. We like to take quite a holistic approach, as well as the one-to-one work, the group work, those very structured interventions. There's also that holistic offer as well, because that doesn't work for everybody. So within Together, we've got something called Flourish in Nature, which is basically activities out in nature. So during the winter months, we tend to do things a lot more sort of indoors, a lot more sort of like arts and crafts, and we get other agencies in. So at the moment, we've got African drumming as one of our offers. And in the summer, we'll do lots of walks. We'll do things like kayaking, canoeing, and climbing, those kinds of things. And then alongside that as well, we do have that prescribing offer. So we have an in-house prescribing team who will prescribe OST, which is opiate substitution therapy. So for those that are dependent on opiates, prescribing methadone or buprenorphine to help them stop that illicit use. We will also we do also offer community detoxes as well for those that use alcohol, so that we can do a safe community detox with them, which is medicine led. So we're actually prescribing to be able to help them come off of alcohol. And then we also offer relapse prevention medication as well. So once people are no longer using substances, there are medications they can take that act as a sort of relapse prevention barrier. So for example, if you were to use alcohol on top, it would make you very unwell. So the idea is that it acts as a bit of a barrier. So yeah, those are some of the different sort of interventions that would be on offer.
Lovely. That's
Quick
great.
question
Thank
in
you.
the chat.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes.
Is there support for codependents, family members, parents, etc.?
Yeah, so I've actually included this in the Together specific slide. I'm not sure about what provision you've got sort of within Y-Smart specifically, but within Together, we do have a family worker within each of the hubs. So if a parent comes in and uses our service, and they have children, they will be allocated to a family worker as their main practitioner, because they're able to do a little bit more around that sort of family work and engagement, potentially with other services as well that might be involved too. And we're always looking into how we can increase that sort of family provision as well. And then as well as that, we also have a family and friends smart group. So where I said we've got that mutual aid, we deliver a family and friends online smart group, and that's for families and friends of people that use substances to be able to come along and get a little bit of support from others that might be in a similar situation to them.
And yet in Y Smart, we do the Y Project, and so that's our work with young people mainly, who are impacted on by parental or family member substance misuse. We can offer extra bits and pieces around to support parents as well, and we often try to work with young people where they're at. Obviously, we have confidentiality as well, so that we will that can be a bit of a battle sometimes around encouraging involvement with parents as well. However, we have to sort of do that on a needs basis. But we know that better outcomes come when you've got a family working together in the right way. So we also know that we need to encourage that. Um, but we would work, and there's some plans coming in the future and more co-collaboration with our adult partners around the use of their family work as an identification of young people, and then us being able to support young people, and then the adult service being able to support the adults in the family home as well. And hopefully then that can be very interchangeable in terms of we would be able to respond to knowing where the parent is in treatment, and then trying to dispel some of the myths for the young person, and trying to give them, if you like, a roadmap around what that looks like, and that addiction doesn't mean that they don't love their children. Addiction doesn't mean that isn't the children's fault. There's a lot around kind of dispelling a lot of those internal thoughts. I've put Blinko here just for you guys. Some of you might be already aware of it. 2012 is a resilience framework. So this is really an underpinning of a lot of things that we do with young people, and also there's a lot of universal concepts here, and that's why I really, really like it. It's also got the noble truths, which are more mental health kind of thing of accepting, conserving, commitment, and listing. But underneath that, you've got it boiling down to sort of basics: belonging, learning, coping, core self, and then it breaks it down. So what you can see there is there's so many things we can do to prevent someone escalating into misuse of their use. And what we try to do as services is we try to put in other things. So what Christy was alluding to with the activity-based stuff is we'd call them positive diversionary activities. So those things that give people a sense of value, make people feel good about themselves, sometimes can even mimic a feeling that they might get from a substance. So hopefully we're giving them a different pathway they could go to seek an effect, but in a more of a constructive kind of way. Young minds. Well, most of you should know this stuff, if particularly if you work with young people, that actually to build resilience, all you need is one trusted adult that holds you in mind. Schools are brilliant at doing this when it comes to, you see in primary schools, they'll meet a child at the front gate and they say, "Hello, how are you? Nice to see you." It's showing and holding those young people in mind. What the practitioner is also, the teacher is also doing, is they're also looking at the family and seeing what's going on there and who's bringing them. So they've got all that going on as well. But for the young person, it's also welcoming them in. And if their home life is invalidating, then of course that's a really positive thing. The challenge is if you are that person, that one trusted adult, young, very vulnerable young people will push all of your buttons. Any professionals working here will be aware of that, and it can be very, very tough if you're on the receiving end of that. But of course, for a lot of young people, they're trying to find a way of feeling safe, and safety can come from boundaries and knowing where your boundary is. So they might push and push and push to make sure that they feel safe as well. So obviously activities, hobbies, sports, there's safe spaces for young people who just want to get out. Having that hopes and aspirations are huge. And what I hate is when I hear from, and I have heard it many times from professionals where they say, "Oh, I'm a realist. I'll tell the young person they're never going to achieve that in their life." And it gets me really frustrated because who are we to say what someone might achieve in their life? You know, but they might. I have a friend who wanted to be a pilot. He couldn't be a pilot in the end because he was colorblind, but he became a thing called a non-destructive testing engineer for Flybe, flown all over the world. And he was working in the aerospace industry and earning far more than pilots did. So what I'm saying is, although that might be unrealistic when they say I want to be an astronaut, but actually that aspiration might help to point them in a certain direction that might then mean that substances become less important to them as well. So self-soothing skills, we know there's a lot of vulnerable young people who are unable to manage those feelings. If we add neurodiversity, neurodivergent, that makes a whole nother challenge there, around how people can regulate and manage those feelings. And particularly with young people, because we know that there is that sense of that overlapping of adults or parents, frontal cortex over young people, as a way of trying to sort of guide them as well. Hidden harm. I'm not really going to talk to this much, apart from saying that hidden harm is around young people being impacted on by parental or family member substance misuse. They estimate it's around about 250,000 to 350,000 children. However, what I would suggest is that 500,000 would be more realistic. There are over 332,000 problem drug users in the UK. And if you said that each one of those had one child, then that would be about 332,000. But a lot have more than one child. So we could put it reasonably at 500,000 young people being impacted on. The reason why we call it hidden is because young people love their parents. They might not love what their parents do. And they also may have been told that if they say anything, that they're going to get taken away or put in care or something like that. And there's a whole set of sort of myths that are connected to this. And young people get sort of start to personalize it, believe it's their own issue. In some cases, their lived experience is so normalized that I had a young person I was talking earlier that, and she was 8 years old, and in class when they started talking about very basic stuff to do with drugs and alcohol within their PSHE, the young person started talking about heroin. And the whole class, after she finished, were just staring open mouthed at her. And she then said, in my session after, she said, I then realized that my life is not like theirs. And so she just thought that was normal. That's what happens. So again, that's why we call it hidden harm. It's very difficult to find out about. But we do the Y project. We started it many years ago, because we recognise the importance, and also it could potentially lead to more vulnerability in those young people, which could potentially lead to long-term life challenges, as well, which one part may be substance misuse. For those who are academically minded, look up Cleaver et al. In 1999. What you'll notice if you've done your level 3 safeguarding training is you'll notice developmental ages down the one side, and then it will put around the impact of substance misuse on that development. We see often a gender divide around about the age of 5 to 9, where boys have a tendency to act out and girls have a tendency to internalize. I would be interesting to see over the next several years whether that starts to change. But that's what we tend to see. 10 to 14 is where they'll often start to come to our service. So they start looking at maybe their own substance misuse as being more of a challenge, or a whole range of other kind of developmental challenges that go on there, higher risk of offending as well. And 15 plus, obviously, increasing that as well. And more risk of things like early pregnancy, STIs, BBVs, that kind of stuff as well. Okay. So that is why smart. And what we do is very similar to adult services, but we run, so we'll go out to a lot of educational facilities out of mainstream education, and we deliver targeted education to groups. So those groups that are often identified as being vulnerable to substance misuse or to escalation from their current use to more misuse. and so that's what we call tier two work. That's also the type of work we do where it's harm reduction that Christy talked about. So how can you do what you do a little bit safer, and targeted education. So that's that main early start point, preventative kind of work. Our tier three comes in where we start doing more one-to-one targeted delivery to those individuals, and we will be doing things like assessments and care planning. So care planning, what do they want to do, how do they want to do it, and then it's very structured treatment. So we would use things like the cycle of change, De Clemente and Prochaska, again, if you wanted to look that up. And the cycle of change is a way of describing how change happens to people, and so we'd often use that as a tool to assist us with varying different approaches. We use things like, and exactly the same as the adult services, we use things like CBT, so cognitive behavioural therapy, MI, motivational interviewing. We also, all of our team are now uh, dialectual behavioral DBT trained, dialectual behavioral therapy trained. And some of us are Thrive trained as well for more of the kind of earlier or younger young people and those kind of approaches. But yeah, and then the last bit is our Y project. So that's our work, like I've said, with substance misusing parents. We've got a really helpful connection with the Forestry Commission at the moment. So we run on school holidays, we run Y project groups where we'll bring together a group of young people to do things like forest school activities and such like. We're working on a current link up in North and in Devon with the National Trust to also do a similar kind of thing where we're doing sort of similar sort of forest skills and such like. So we have a range of different things that we can do around that. If you need to refer to us, then probably the best way is to have a look at our website. We've got referrals on there. We've got either a Y Project referral, which is again is the young people impacted on by parental substance misuse, but we also have the Y Smart referral form, which is their own use and working with them. We also work in conjunction with our adult colleagues in a thing called the Transitions Panel. So that's looking at those young people who are 18 but may not developmentally be suitable for an adult approach at that stage. So that would be very care experienced individuals. That could also be neurodivergent condition, or it could be neurodiversity issues. But we've opened up a little bit broader as well to have a look at those young people who just couldn't be suitable. So we've had ones who have significant social anxiety, who might need a more tailored approach, and we would negotiate with adult services as to who would be best to support that young person. So both of our approaches are a start point from the needs of a young person or adult, and then we sort of move from that point onwards. We also have email, so email us into our mailbox if you have any queries. We have duty practitioners, as do Together, available so that you can, if you need to chat something through, and as professionals, you may have one of those, I've got this young person, I'm just not sure. Then those kind of conversations can come to either ourselves or adult service if that's appropriate, and then we could probably, work something out from that point. So yeah, so we'll have a practitioner available for that as well. So that is us. So there you go. That's what we do. Yeah, and then we move on to Christy. So I don't know if you want to. Oh, do you want me to put that back on there?
Yeah, so this slide is basically, you'll get a copy of these. Claire's
Yes.
just said that she's going to send them out next week.
Sure.
So this is just a little bit about where you can find our website, our professional referral email address, and how self-referrals can be made as well, and just a little bit about the three hubs as well. So I'm the service manager for South and West, so from everywhere between sort of Teignbridge, South Hams, West Devon, Teignmouth, Dawlish. We then and then excluding Plymouth and Torbay. And then we've got Exeter, East and Mid Devon, and then we've also got North and Torridge as well. So three different hubs. But saying that, we do also use satellite sites as well. So for example, down in the sort of south and west area, we use a doctor's surgery out in Dartmouth. We use the Strand in Dawlish. We use Abbey Surgery out in Tavistock. We use a surgery in Ivybridge. We've got sort of satellite sites all around because it's a very, very, very large area. And then the next slide, I think I've gone into a bit of detail already about some of the services we offer based on a previous slide. But like Simon said, we have a duty worker every day. So somebody that is on that 0800 number, regardless of which area it is in Devon, we have duty workers in all three hubs who can offer sort of just brief interventions and support and advice. I've mentioned as well that we do a lot of harm reduction work, but we also do BBV testing, so bloodborne viruses. So we can test for hepatitis C and also HIV, and we do offer hepatitis B vaccinations as well. We also offer naloxone. So all of our staff are trained in how to use naloxone, and we also offer naloxone to all service users that put themselves in risky situations where naloxone would be useful. We also do a lot of training for external providers as well around naloxone and how to administer it. Naloxone is a opiate reverser. So similar to an EpiPen, it can be used if somebody overdoses on opiates to reverse the effects, and it acts pretty immediately,
And
which
they're
is really
usually not very
useful.
happy.
And they're usually very unhappy that we've ruined that hit for them. But it is a life-saving substance,
Absolutely.
and ambulance services, the police, security services sort of within town centres all tend to have some naloxone now on their person, or they'll be trained in how to use it if they do spot somebody that they believe has overdosed.
And you will
Just to
see
add,
more of
oh,
that
sorry.
coming, won't you, Christy? Because there is a big
Yes.
push from public health to get more and more people aware of naloxone. Certainly in young people's
Yes.
services, we're all trained as well. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully one day we'll have some lovely vending machines in the streets, so that if we need it, we can access it immediately. Um, so just to add to the psychosocial offer that we do have a criminal justice team specifically. It's a very, very large team within Together. And we work with those that are on criminal justice orders or under probation, but also those that are coming out of prison. And as well as that, we also now have what is called IPS, which is employment support, which has only rolled out in January. So all of the sort of background work's been going on for the last couple of months in terms of recruitment and getting some employment specialists on board, but that rolled out in January. So we're now able to offer employment support to individuals that are using drug and alcohol services as well, which is really brilliant.
well, now this is that wonderful time. Thank you very much.